In episode 17 of the CompTIA PenTest Plus training series, we are going to continue with our exploits and attacks, and today we're going to be talking about host-based attacks. So first episode we talked about prioritizing the attacks, and then we talked about attacking the network, and then we talked about authentication attacks, and now we're going to be attacking individual hosts. So host-based attacks target the local machine itself, right? So we're not attacking necessarily users via authentication, or we're not necessarily attacking the network at large. We're attacking individual machines. And we're doing it by exploiting the misconfigurations or weak permissions or credential storage mechanisms that exist on those machines to escalate our privileges, to dump passwords, or execute stealthy malware, among many other things. There are a lot of other things that you can do. These types of attacks are critical in post-exploitation scenarios, allowing attackers to gain persistence and full system control. So post-exploitation essentially is referring to the fact that up until this point, let's say we've attacked the network, right? And we got the user credentials for a specific user via the authentication attack. And now we're inside of a system, okay? So we're inside of the network, inside of an individual host. So what we are doing, or what we've done so far, is we've executed the exploitation effectively. And now we need to do something post that initial exploitation, and the main goal is to gain persistence. And persistence means that you want to stay in the system. You don't want to get kicked out either by accident or because they figured something out and now you have to do the initial exploit all over again. And most likely the second time, or I would say 100% of the time, the second time that you try to exploit that same system, it's going to be much more difficult because they're going to backtrack to see what you did that first time, and then they're going to fill in all of those leaks. They're going to fix the vulnerabilities, patch the system to make sure that whatever your initial step in was, whatever your first method to get in was, you can't do that again. So that's why it's important to stay and gain persistence. And there are a lot of different tactics to be able to do this. And once you actually have persistence, once you're in the system, ideally, let's say indefinitely, then now you can get full system control and you can start doing a lot of things almost as if you own the system, right? As if you're the domain admin on that system and you have full control of the system and maybe even full control of the network segment and maybe even full control of the network itself. So those would be all escalated levels of persistence and post-exploitation tactics and techniques. So in this specific video, we're going to be covering privilege escalation and what that actually means and what it's like to do privilege escalation on both Windows and Linux or Unix-based machines. Then we're going to be talking about credential dumping, so essentially extracting the passwords and hashes as well as the users that they belong to. So when we think about credentials, we're thinking about the combination, both the user and the password. So we're going to be dumping credentials based on whatever the users are, and if we can get plain text, that would be amazing, but at the very least, we're going to try to get hashes of the password so that we can do something called pass the hash attack, which is what we talked about in the last video when we were talking about authentication attacks. And then we're going to talk about process hollowing and living off the land binaries, also known as LOLBins. So this originally, when I saw LOLBins, I thought are they talking about laugh out loud? Like, what are we talking about here? And I had no idea that this is what they meant by saying living off the land. And think about that as the concept that, let's say you are thrown in a jungle and you're a soldier and you're not going to be picked up for months or years. And now what you have to do is you have to try to figure out how to survive off of the land that you are in, because your supplies that they gave you, they're eventually going to run out. Your food rations are going to run out. So you have to learn how to find clean water. You have to learn how to hunt for food and how to survive the terrain and all of those things. And that's very similar to what's going to be happening if you are inside of a specific system for an extended period of time. And maybe you need to hollow out a process and embed your source code inside of that process and disguise your source code as if it was a legitimate process. Maybe that's what you got to do. Or maybe you got to try to find ways to actually live off of the resources that are available on that machine so that you can persist and stay there and gain control at some point. I don't know whatever it is that you would have to do, but you would have to try to figure out how to live off of the binaries that come within that system. And finally, we're going to be talking about host-based attack tools. We wrap all of these sections for exploitation and attacks with the tools that we would end up using to pull these types of things off. And Mimikatz is a really big one when it comes down to credential dumping. There is Evil WinRM that is specific to Windows. There's Seatbelt, and then of course there is LOLBins. So it's a good episode. We're going to be talking about a lot of good stuff, and there's a lot of great topics to cover, and I am excited to share them with you. So real quick, a quick message from our sponsor, Hackaholics Anonymous, and then we'll dive into it. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. The agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there, or you can go to youtube.com/@hankhackshackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous. Now, without further ado, let us continue with PenTest Plus. Okay, first let's talk about privilege escalation, and specifically privilege escalation in a Windows environment. I'm going to give you a couple of examples in Windows, and then we're going to go through a couple of examples in Linux. But the key here is for you to understand what this actually means and what the concept is and how it can be pulled off, essentially. So privilege escalation allows you, the attacker, to move from a low privilege user to an admin or root privilege, or maybe like domain admin, right? And this is often necessary to further your exploitation, gain persistence, and lateral movement. Because most likely, whatever that low privilege user was that you initially got the credentials for, and maybe you did it through social engineering, whatever that user was, they don't have the permissions that you need to do anything serious inside of that system or inside of that network. So you have to find a way to escalate your privileges. Now, in a Windows environment, the first method would be to exploit misconfigured service permissions. So some services allow low privileged users to modify executables that leads to privilege escalation. So if you can modify the executable, that means you can inject it with some kind of code or some kind of malware payload, whatever it is, so that the next time that it runs, it can potentially lead to you escalating your privileges, right? So that's the first, or at least conceptually, that's what that means, to exploit misconfigured service permissions. Now, the first thing that you have to do is you need to first find it, right? So you need to find a misconfigured service, and we can do this using Seatbelt. And so being that this is a Windows executable, obviously it ends with .exe. That's one of the key differentiators. When you look at anything that has .exe, 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, you can conclude that this is a Windows command. This is being run on Windows terminal, okay? So what we're trying to do is you're going to launch Seatbelt, and it's going to do what it does, and it's going to find a group that has system level permissions that you can potentially exploit, right? So weakly configured services that can be exploited, and they should have system level permissions is kind of what we're trying to do, right? Then we need to exploit that service. So we're going to run this command right here, which is using a I think it's called SOCAT or soft. I forget what it's called, but it's like the counterpart to netcat. For whatever reason, the name is escaping me right now. But you're running 3 different commands in this particular case. You're running this command first, then you're running this one, and then you're running this one. So this will replace a legitimate service with a malicious executable. So you're configuring the vulnerable service, right? And you're assigning it to this binary path, which is going to be this reverse shell executable payload that you would have transferred to this computer in some capacity. Maybe you downloaded it from a public file share, or you transferred it using, just a wget kind of a command where you downloaded from a server that you own, or you turned your attack box, your attacking computer, into a temporary server, and then while you're inside of this machine using your remote connection through that remote terminal, you downloaded this reverse shell, whatever it is, right? So, but you have a reverse shell executable, and that reverse shell executable is going to be assigned to the binary path for this service, and then you're going to start it, and then you're going to start the actual service. So you're going to turn on the services essentially. And then what you're going to do is you're going to start that specific server or service that you configured, right? So once you start the service, it's going to execute that path, which is going to be your reverse shell. And then now you're going to gain that reverse shell connection to your attack box from the target, right? So kind of a 2 or 3 step method here. First, we need to find whatever the service is. And so you find the service, and in this case, it's called vuln service, so like the vulnerable service, but obviously it's not going to be called this, but you find whatever it is using this command. And then once you have found it, you can then go ahead and modify it, right, to assign the binary path for that to be this executable that you have here. And then you're going to start it, and then when it runs, it's going to execute that reverse shell payload, and from there you're going to get a reverse shell remote connection to your attacking machine. The second method on a Windows computer is going to be the impersonation of a token, and there's something called the SE impersonate privilege. This is actually something that exists, right? And so this is something that if it's been enabled, right, based on the privileges of whatever your user is that you've logged in with, if this has been enabled, then you can actually create a potential escalation attack and an escalation vector for yourself. So you can impersonate the system level processes, right? Meaning you get system level privileges, right? Even though you may not be a high level user, but if your user, so when you run whoami/privileges, you're going to see what privileges have been assigned to your user. And if you see that SE impersonate privilege is on, or the value is true or whatever, if you see that, you can rest assured that you can actually now launch system level processes, right? You can impersonate system level processes. And if you can impersonate system level processes, that means you can modify something and then establish your reverse shell or some kind of a payload that will help you gain that persistence. For this one, we're going to be using the Juicy Potato executable. I really like this name. But essentially what it does is it uses token impersonation to execute commands as the system, and the placeholder here is the token GUID, so you would need to get that GUID, and then the command is going to be executed, or the command line executable, the terminal is going to be executed with the token that you are impersonating, so that you can get system level privileges. So essentially you would be launching the terminal, the command line terminal, with the token GUID that belongs to the system, right? So if you can impersonate the system, then you can actually launch something like this and then launch the command line, launch the terminal with system level privileges. So the mitigations against this type of attack, the mitigations against Windows privilege escalation, would be to, number one, restrict this specific privilege. So turn it off, basically. Don't have it be available to anybody. Or at the very least, if you're going to have it be available, only make it available to trusted accounts, which is essentially, let's say, high-level admins, right? Maybe not just the domain admin, maybe your top 5 privileged accounts should be the only ones that can actually impersonate the system, right? Everybody else should not have access to this. The new user or the lower level management should not have access to stuff like this because they shouldn't be able to impersonate the system. Then you want to use Windows Defender attack surface reduction. And these are rules that you can establish to reduce the attack surface for somebody that might get into your system, and you don't want them to be able to attack whatever it is. So like you want to leave a very small number of services that can be attacked, and if you can, remove all of them. Like don't leave anything behind that can be attacked, but whatever is left behind should be extremely hardened so that it's not easily exploitable, right? But at the very least, you would want to reduce your attack surface to the bare minimum. If possible, completely remove the attack surface. So use Windows Defender and the ASR rules of Windows Defender, those attack surface reduction rules, to reduce the attack surface. And finally, the most basic, which is the most powerful in my opinion, it's like one of the most powerful, it's just keep your Windows up to date, right? Make sure that you actually update your Windows system as soon as a new version comes out, mainly because of the fact that there are vulnerabilities that are patched. So when things become discovered, they become reported, and Windows is aware of them, and they even have bug bounty programs to kind of contract the public to get people that may be running as freelancers in the pen testing community to attack all of the Windows systems and their services and all these things, to come up with potential vulnerabilities so that they can go ahead and patch those vulnerabilities in advance. And then when those things are patched, then they're going to roll out a new update, and they're going to say update this, to the most recent version of Windows. And you want to do that, right? So there used to be this thing, and this was like when I was first kind of coming up with just using computers, that they'd be like, yeah, I don't want to update my Windows because it's going to make my computer run slower, because the computer, the physical hard drive of the computer and the hardware of the computer, it was so outdated that it couldn't handle the new updates. And so if that's the case, then you need to update the hardware. It's not really complicated, you know what I mean? It's not a complex concept. Sorry about the noise in the background. The neighbors are rolling around with their stinking little bikes that they have with their loud, extremely annoying engines. But anyways, if your system is affected by an update, meaning if the hardware is affected by an update and you are going to run a slower system simply because there was a new update that was rolled out, then you need to update your hardware as well as the software. And there's a reason why every, let's say, 3 to 5 years, the computers that are compared to the ones from 5 years ago seem like they're so advanced, because in 5 years, so much can happen with technology and the advancement in the CPUs and the GPUs and all the things that are physically installed on a computer. So much advancement can take place that it just makes it seem like everything else is obsolete. Moving on to Linux privilege escalation. So the first method that we'll be talking about would be to exploit the SUID binaries. Now, this is actually something that we've done in several videos on this particular channel. And SUID binaries are essentially, I think we used to refer to them as super users or special users. And there are specific binaries that actually have those SUID privileges set, right? There are execute. There you go. There are execute privileges that have been set with certain binaries that have that super user or special user ID assigned to it. So if those things are actually accessible to the user that you're running with, to the user that you have now exploited, you can then go ahead and use them to elevate your privileges, right? To escalate your privileges. So you're first going to try to find those binaries, and then if you can find them and see if you can actually use them and execute them, then from there you'll be able to escalate your privileges by doing just manipulations to the source code or injecting payloads, things like that. The process for this one is a little bit more straightforward than doing it on a Windows machine, because we could literally just search for the executables on a Linux machine via the permissions that are set, right? So this specific command is going to search through the root. Basically, this / represents the entire computer that you're on. So it's the root folder, and then you're looking for permissions that have a 4000. This is the numerical value for binaries that actually have the execute for root privileges permission set. And then this piece right here just sends all of the permission error messages, or not permitted, whatever. All of those error messages are just going to be sent to the dev null folder, which basically means that they're just going to be deleted. But you're going to face a lot of error messages, and it's going to make it difficult to find the actual binaries that you can execute. So you want to get rid of all the error messages and only see the results. So when you run this, you will be able to only see the results, and then from here you just exploit them. And so this echo command will take this specific path and put it inside of this specific location, which would end up being the malicious script. And then we would run the chmod, also known as change mode. And what we're doing is we're adding the execute permission to this new script that we have right here that now has the bash inside of it, right? The path to the bash, or basically the shell, essentially is what that is. And then from there, we run it. So when you actually provide the full path like this and you press enter, it executes whatever the script is, right? So you're running 3 commands essentially. And by the time that you run the 3rd command, the script itself will have launched and it will be running, and it would then execute that custom script as a root if the SUID binary allows that execution, right? So you first find it, and then from there you would send it to whatever your malicious script is going to be, change the permission of that script so that it can actually execute, and then run it. And if that SUID permission is set, then it'll run, and it'll run it as root privileges, which means whatever the script was initially, whatever the intention behind that script was, is now going to run as root privileges. So if you want to create a new user, or if you want to create a reverse shell connection, or anything along those lines, you would be running that command as a root user with root privileges. Now this one is even more straightforward. So there's something called sudo inside of the Linux environment that essentially when you precede any command with sudo, you're going to attempt to run that command as a root user. Now, typically when you do this, when you run sudo and then you follow it up with whatever the command is, immediately after you press enter, you're going to be prompted to enter the sudo password, or the password for whatever user you're logged in. And if that user is not on the sudoers list, they don't have sudo permissions, then you won't be able to run it with root privileges or sudo permissions. But sometimes the sudo command for that user is configured to not require a password. So if sudo does not require a password, that means you can basically use it with any command, and you would be able to find a vector to escalate your privileges. So to find out what your sudo permissions are, you would just do sudo-l, and if all is listed, so if you see the keyword all listed in the result of this, then the user that you are in can execute commands with root or as root without a password. And it's very, very straightforward. It's kind of like one of those low-hanging fruits, but you would be surprised how often this is actually doable, how often it's accessible, because system administrators are not necessarily security people. So just keep this in mind, right? Like in IT and computer science and all these things, because of the fact that it's such a vast topic and such a large category, such a big world, right? The tech world is massive. There are so many specialties, and people come in with individual specializations, and somebody who's managing users may not necessarily have a security background. They may just know how to administer users on a Linux machine, right? And so, or maybe they were just so busy and they were careless, they forgot to configure the sudo permissions for a given user, and it would just be silly for you not to try to see if you have this permission, right? If you have sudo, you can run sudo without a password requirement. So it's one of those things that you got to do it. You got to check off the box. Okay, I checked, there's a password that's required, but at least I checked. And that's the key element here, is that we want to first go for all of the low-hanging fruit to see if there is an easy way in or an easy way to escalate our privileges. And if there is, awesome. If there isn't, then we'll move on to the more complex stuff. And the implementation of that is literally you just run sudo bash and it will launch bash with admin privileges, with root sudo privileges, but it's not going to ask you for a password, right? So normally if you did this, if you did sudo bash, press enter, the very next thing is that you would be prompted for a password. But if it's been misconfigured and it's not requiring a password, you just do sudo bash and then all of a sudden you have a bash shell that's open and it has root privileges attached to it, and now you can do whatever the heck you want inside of that bash shell as a root user. The mitigations against something like this would be to restrict the SUID binaries to essential programs only. So do not, and this is a part of system hardening, you want to remove those SUID binaries to essential programs, the things that are absolutely necessary, and then those should be limited with the functionalities that they can offer. They should be limited with the types of users or the list of the users that can modify them or access them, do anything like that. They would only be running in the background. Nobody should be able to access binaries to modify the source code inside of a binary or to modify the path of a binary. These things should not be allowed by just random everyday users or even, low admin or mid-level management kind of people. They should not be able to reassign the path to an SUID binary, right? Or to reassign or to reconfigure or to modify the source code of a binary. These types of things should not be accessible to anybody other than the advanced super level privileged users. We are going to limit sudo access to necessary commands. So there's a way that you can just turn off sudo access to most commands, and you can just configure that so that whoever wants to run it, they shouldn't even be able to run it. They may have sudo privileges for their local machine to be able to do certain things, but most other things they shouldn't even be able to do, right? They should not even have that permission assigned to these certain commands that can do big damage on a system and inside of a network. And finally, we can use something like SE Linux or App Armor. So Security Linux, essentially an App Armor, to enforce stricter execution rules, which is again a part of system hardening. And then the one that's not listed here, that was listed in the Windows section that we just went through, is updates, right? Make sure that you have the most recent version of Linux that you're using. Make sure that as new versions of Linux are rolled out, you're updating. You're constantly running the apt update command or yum update, whatever the package manager is that is installed on your distribution of Linux. You want to be running update every single time that you launch the machine, because you want to make sure everything is the most recent version of that thing. And that's one of the easiest ways that you can avoid these types of things even happening, is to just make sure every binary and everything that's installed on that machine is actually the most recent version. And then from there you can go into limiting sudo access and restricting SUID binaries, etc., etc., etc. Okay, let's move on to credential dumping, which is essentially extracting passwords and their hashes, dumping all of the passwords and hashes from that machine, right? The stuff that's been stored on that machine. So credential dumping allows the attacker, you, to steal the passwords that have been stored, the NTLM hashes that have been stored, and any authentication tokens from memory or disk, meaning from the random access memory or the hard drive. And these credentials can be used for lateral movement or past the hash attacks or further exploitation, and maybe even privilege escalation, right? So the dumping of the credentials on Windows can be done with Mimikatz, and then you can also do it on Linux machines as well. But Mimikatz is one of the more popular ones to use on a Windows machine. And so Mimikatz is a post-exploitation tool, meaning it requires that you have already logged into a machine. You've exploited a machine, and now you're in there and you're potentially as a lower level user. So what you're going to do is you're going to try to dump all of the stored passwords and credentials that is on that machine's disk or on that machine's random access memory, and you're going to try to dump it, right? But it requires that you have established the first layer of exploitation. You've already exploited the machine, and now once you're inside the machine, you're going to be running Mimikatz to see if you can dump any credentials from Windows memory. So this is a sample command. This is actually technically 4 commands, because you could run Mimikatz, press enter, then wait for it to launch, then you can run the privilege debug, and then you can do secure LSA or secure LSA, and then get logon passwords, and then you would run exit at the end to exit out of Mimikatz. So technically we have 4 commands here, but the way that it's been written, I believe it actually runs everything in one command and then it exits after it's done, which is good if you're in a time crunch. And it extracts the plain text passwords and NTLM hashes, this specific command that you see right here. And then we can dump credentials from the SAM database by doing kind of a registry save, and then the HK local machine SAM, and then save that, and then you could do the same thing and then do HKLM system and then save those, and then you could be dumping credentials from the SAM database that would exist on that Windows machine as well. This is actually the note that explains the last command that we just looked at right here. And then finally we have cracking extracted hashes using Hashcat. So at this point you've dumped hashes, right? You've dumped passwords, you've dumped credentials, you have dumped the Windows SAM database, and now you're going to run Hashcat to go ahead and try to, crack those hashes. Again, we've talked about this multiple times. Hashes can only be cracked assuming there's a plain text version of it somewhere. So it would compare it against, for example, the raw queue list, right? There's tens of millions of passwords in that list. So what Hashcat is going to do is based on the algorithm that you've chosen right here, which is NTLM. So M1000 is basically the algorithm code for NTLM hashes. So what Hashcat is going to do is going to take every single one of the plain text entries inside of rawqueue.txt, and it's going to convert those into its equivalent hash value. And if you already have studied this, and you should already know that a given word can only have one hash value. So Hashcat can, especially with a capital H, right? So Hashcat with a capital H will only have one hash value. And every single time that you try to hash this again and again and again, it should yield the same exact hash value. So what we're doing is that we're going to hash every single one of the words in here and then compare those hashes against the hashes that are inside of this file. And if we find a match, then we're going to be like, oh, you know what? This belongs to this one plain text word that would turn into password dot whatever. You know what I mean? So whatever the password is going to be, we find the hash value, compare it against the list of hashes, and then if we find a match, then we know what the plain text is. So we're using a dictionary attack to crack that NTLM hash using Hashcat. On Linux, for dumping credentials, we're going to use a very similar command to what we did previously, and we're looking through the entire machine by using find /, and then this time around we're looking for a name, and the name is going to have ID _ RSA in it, and then we're looking for a file type. So you could do type D for directory or type F for file. So we're looking for an ID RSA file, essentially, and then we're sending all of the error messages to dev null. So what we're going to get, ideally, if this works and if it actually exists and we can find it, we would find the unencrypted SSH keys that can be used for authentication, and we would just pass this as a key when we try to log in via SSH as a specific user. So this is kind of, again, like a very straightforward way to find a key file. And from there, you would just use that key file to authenticate yourself instead of trying to find the plain text password for the person. So very similar to pass the hash, except this time we're just passing the key. Once you've found the file, you would use something like secure copy, which is essentially an encrypted copy mechanism that you can use to transfer the file to this location. So in this particular case, we're sending it to the attacker at the malicious server. This would be the username of the attacker. This would be the IP address of their server or even a domain name. And then you do : and then give it the path that you want to store this specific file. So it'll transfer that private key to the attacker's controlled server. And when you press enter on this, it's going to ask you for the password for this specific authentication mechanism, these credentials right here. And as long as you enter the password correctly, Secure Copy is going to transfer this file to this location. And then now you have a copy of the key, and then you can use that to secure shell and remote connect into the Linux machine. So the mitigations against credential dumping would be using Windows Defender Credential Guard to protect the LSAS memory from being dumped and from being stolen, and enforcing SSH key passphrases to prevent stolen key reuse. So if somebody actually steals the key, you want there to be a passphrase on this key, right? So you want there to be an extra layer of authentication that's required for somebody to even be able to use this key. So a password to access the password, essentially, like a password to access the key. And then you want to limit the access to the SAM, to the system, and to the security registry hives, because these specific hives, these specific registry paths store credentials, right? They store the sensitive data that can be used to essentially exploit that system further, or exploit networks, or go into different users, do lateral movement, and then do escalated privileges, so vertical movement, and so on and so forth. So they're basic. These things are not complicated things. They're just very, very, very powerful things. So you just want to restrict access to these specific locations to, admin users, like domain admins or root level users. Moving on to process hollowing and living off the land. So process hollowing, as I mentioned in the intro, is essentially the process, or the mechanism or the process of taking a legitimate process and hollowing it out, right? Replacing what is inside of the shell. So think about a box, right? You empty out the box and then you put whatever you want inside the box. And anytime that somebody opens that box, your stuff is in there and your malicious code will execute, right? This is the most famous version of this is the Trojan horse. And there are things called Trojan software or Trojan malware, things like that, that they seem like they're a normal process, but internally they have a bunch of malicious stuff inside of it. So in this particular case, you would replace the memory of that legitimate process with malicious code, which allows the stealthy execution, because every time that it runs, the system logs, and whoever the analyst is that's looking at those logs is going to be like, oh, this was just Windows Explorer that was launching, when in actuality it was a malicious process that was, or a malicious code that was inside of that legitimate looking process. So this is commonly used for running fileless malware execution. So when you have a malware file, typically the signature of the file, or maybe some of the source codes of the file, can set off alerts in the intrusion detection or the security engagement event managers, or essentially the firewall itself, or the firewall and the antivirus software itself. So if you use a fileless execution, meaning that essentially it just launches the malware from a source code or a payload that is launched when you have a remote connection, or the malware is now inside of a legitimate file, right? So instead of downloading the malware file, you copy the malware source code and you put it inside of a legitimate file, and then it launches that legitimate file. And technically the malware doesn't have a file. It's actually running inside of the shell of a different file. Bypassing antivirus detection is a really big one as well, because again, malware files themselves have signatures that if you download that malware file, antivirus is going to be like, nope, I'm not letting you do this because I know this signature. I recognize that signature. Therefore, I know this specific file is malicious. So if we want to bypass antivirus detection, we want to disguise our malware inside of the shell of a recognized specific process that the antivirus is going to be like, oh no, you're good. You're good to go through, right? You're good to pass. And then we inject malicious payloads into system processes, which is basically everything that we just talked about so far. So I'm not going to beat that to death. So here's the example, right? I literally used Explorer as an example, and we actually have the example here being that, so we have the injecting of a malicious payload into the explorer.exe, and this would be the full command, right? So this is a commandlet that is being launched inside of Windows, and we're using it to inject for the process, and then we're going to give the PE path, which is going to be shellcode binary, and then the process name is going to be explorer.exe. So this is where our binary code is going to be injected inside of this file right here, or inside of this executable, and then the next time that this executable is launched by a user that doesn't know any better, like unknowingly, they just launch Explorer, and then we have our shellcode that's ran, and now we have remote connection, let's say, or whatever the intention behind this shellcode was that we installed or embedded inside of this this legitimate executable. We put a malicious payload inside of the legitimate executable. So it loads that malicious shellcode into the memory of Explorer. The mitigations against process hollowing would be to enable Windows Defender Exploit Guard to detect memory tampering. So if anybody tries to tamper with the memory of a process, a legitimate process, Windows Defender Exploit Guard will set off alerts, and maybe will even drop the task from actually executing, right? It'll stop it in its tracks before the admin or the system analyst, security analyst is even notified. Windows Defender will just stop it in its tracks. And then you want to do application whitelisting. So for example, using AppLocker or WDAC to block unauthorized scripts. So whitelisting means technically allowing something, but that means that everything else is unauthorized. So if it's not on the whitelist, it's basically on the blacklist and it's not accessible. It's not allowed to go through, therefore it will not launch. So you have exclusive, you have things that have been explicitly assigned to the whitelist, and so they're allowed to go through, and everything else is just explicitly denied, right? Automatically denied if it's not on that list. Now, living off the land is essentially similar to what we just talked about, except now we're actually going to be using specific binaries to go ahead and launch the attacks that we want to do, right? Or do the attack that we want to do. So in this case, we would be using certutil.exe, which is used to download files. So you can just use it to download and execute malware. Run DLL32, which executes malicious dynamic link libraries, or it executes dynamic link libraries, but it can be used to execute malicious DLLs. Then I always call this MISHTA, but it's basically MSHTA, but MISHTA.exe, which runs HTML application scripts, and so you can use it to run malicious HTML application scripts. WMIC executes remote commands, and this is kind of like a gimme. So if you can execute remote commands, that means you can remote connect to a attacker's machine, and you can run commands remotely from that attacker machine. And then we have bits.admin.exe, which downloads payloads and executes payloads, which means it can download and execute malicious payloads. And this is just a small list of the binaries that can actually be used. These are legitimate binaries that if there's a PowerShell command or if there's a command line entry inside of your logs and you see this, you're like, oh, this is just whatever, it's WMIC. This is, there's an admin that needs remote access, so they're doing that, right? If you know for a fact that that specific machine should not be doing remote connections and you see WMIC, that's the red flag where it's like, oh, you're not actually even supposed to be running this. What's going on? Like, it's the executable itself is immediately a red flag. And running DLLs just by itself, it should be fine, right? But if the user is not supposed to run specific DLLs on their machine, or no other user is supposed to run it, it's supposed to only be ran by the system itself, and you see it being run, it's like, okay, that's a red flag. So these things themselves, by themselves, in any normal environment, they're not malicious. There's nothing wrong with them because they're just executables they're binaries that can be used to do legitimate activities. It's just that in combination of malicious intent, we can use these executables to do some things that we should not be able to do. And so here's the example using certutil, right? So you would use certutil to download stuff from the internet. So you can use it, and then you would go ahead and essentially download from this specific location that payload and you would save it as payload.exe or whatever the name that doesn't seem shady or anything like that, but you've technically now used a legitimate binary to download something malicious onto the computer, and now you've saved it as a legitimate name as well, so it doesn't seem freaky, right? It doesn't mess with anybody. If they're looking at it at first glance, they're like, oh, that's Explorer. They're just launching Explorer. So the mitigations against this would be to block unnecessary system binaries via a group policy. A group policy is something that's assigned to a group of users, right? So you create a group policy that says, none of the bank tellers should even have access to these binaries, right? No bank teller across the bank should have access to any of these things. No banker or no supervisor should have access to any of these things. Based on their group that they belong in, the group of users that they belong in, there's going to be some kind of a rule that's placed that says you can't access this, right? Like, not you, even if you tried, you shouldn't be able to access this. And I've tried it on the computers at work. I try to do certain things, and then I immediately get a little pop-up that it's like, yep, access to this has been blocked. Contact your system administrator. That's kind of what they say. So, it exists. Like, if it's in a really good environment, if it's in a secure environment, these types of things are not out of the what's the phrase? I forget the phrase, but they're not out of the ordinary, right? This is not something that you wouldn't find in a regular environment. This is just what it is. You block the access to these types of binaries to most of the people inside the company. Most of the people don't need it. Why would they even try to access it? So they don't need it. Don't give them access to it. And then you would use endpoint security solutions to monitor the LOLBin execution. So endpoint detection and response, or security information event managers like Splunk or Snort or a million other things. Wazoo. There are so many different things that you can use to get alerts anytime that somebody's trying to launch a binary that is fishy, right? So it's like, again, it could be legitimate, but we want to make sure that if it is being run by a user that should not be doing it, it's not a part of their job description to run something like that, then we need to keep track of it. And if somebody that isn't supposed to use it is using it, then the username pops up, and then there's like, hey, listen, there's an alert. This person does not have these permissions and they're trying to access this. We need to find out whether or not they were just hacked, right? So the endpoint security and SIM tools and intrusion detection, all of these things, their job is to give you alerts, and you can configure them to be not as noisy because, again, these things can be used for legitimate practices. But if you see it's like the combination is, okay, there's a user that shouldn't even be accessing this binary for their day-to-day job. It's not a part of their responsibility ever to use this binary. So why are they using this binary? And that's where the combination comes in. You look at a user and then you say, okay, this user is not on the list of the people that should be even using this. So why are they trying to launch this? So in combination with the user and the binary, then you're like, oh, you know what? This might be a malicious activity that's going on. Now, as a quick run through, we're just going to review all of the tools that we just talked about. So we definitely talked about Mimikatz. We talked about EvilWinRM. We talked about Seatbelt, LOLBins. And then there was that juicy potato, which is just such a funny word. But so Mimikatz is what's used to dump Windows credentials, for example, NTLM hashes or Kerberos tickets. It's very, very powerful. EvilWinRM is for remote command execution in Windows environments. So Windows WinRM is for remote execution, right? Remote desktop connections. But EvilWinRM is used for command execution in Windows environments maliciously, right? As the name implies. It's not very subtle, that name. And then we have Seatbelt that collects privilege escalation data on Windows and tells you whether or not you can find a group or some kind of an executable or a process that can be used to escalate your privileges. And then we have LOLBins, which are the living off the land, right? The binaries that you can actually use to or abuse those legitimate Windows binaries for stealth attacks or malicious activities. Which finally brings us to our practice questions for this section. So As always, we're going to be using practice question formats that are aligned with the PenTest Plus examination, meaning you will see multiple choice questions, you will see multiple response questions, meaning you have to select 2 or more responses, and then there will be a variety of performance-based questions. Now, the performance-based questions could be something like they'll show you a command and they'll say what would be the output of this command, or they'll show you an output and they'll say what was the command that yielded this output, or they'll give you a scenario, or they'll give you mix and match kind of responses, right? Or mix and match kind of questions. So those types of questions you are going to find inside of this document that I'm using for this lecture. Inside of the slideshow that I'm going to go through with you right now, we're only going to have scenario-based questions, and then the multiple choice and multiple response questions are also going to be included there. The second note about these questions is that they're not identical to the PenTest Plus examination. No source, nothing online is going to show you something that's identical to those exam questions because it's illegal, right? When we actually go to PenTest or really any of the CompTIA exams, when we go in those environments, we sign NDAs. So when we actually go take that exam, they literally make you sign a contract that says you're not going to share these questions with the public. So it's illegal for us to share those questions. So what I can do is I can share something with you or share questions with you that will help you learn how to think about these things. And I'm going to show you how I approach the questions, how if I'm not sure, how I will use the deductive reasoning or process of elimination to find the answer. So it's more about how to take the exam and how to be familiar with these questions and the content that's presented to you so that you can actually critically think and find the answer, because you can't memorize all of the questions and answers. Even if you had the exact questions and answers, it's just so difficult to memorize them because there are so many of them. There are like thousands of them. So you're not going to get anything that will be easy to memorize. So the best way is to learn how to think, to learn how to critically come to a conclusion, and that's what we're going to be doing right now. So let's jump into the slideshow. Okay, here we go. Host-based attacks. Question 1. Which of the following is the goal of privilege escalation during a host-based attack? To lock users out of the system, to trigger antivirus alerts, to gain higher level access to perform administrative actions, to encrypt traffic. Okay, so triggering antivirus alerts is obviously not what we want to do. So that's not the answer. To encrypt traffic between systems is also not the purpose of this. This is more about ransomware. So this is an attack technically, but that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to privilege escalate. We're trying to escalate our privileges or get higher level privileges. And we also don't want to lock users out of the system because that would also be another one of those alerts where it's like, okay, why is this user logged out? So let's go investigate. And then now you have people looking into you, and that's always a bad idea. So you want to stay low key, right? You want to stay under the radar. So you don't want to lock anybody out. So the most obvious answer, and this is another one of those things, right? This is another one of my tactics for this, is the most obvious answer is going to be the answer that I'm going to choose. I'm not going to try to, convince myself or argue with myself that, yeah, but this could be an answer and this could be an answer. That's how you mess yourself up. So you're going to go after the most obvious answer. And in this particular case, it's C, very obviously. Which of the following are common privilege escalation techniques on Windows and Linux systems? So we need to select 2 here. So exploiting vulnerable services or binaries with elevated permissions, that's a yes. Abusing SUID or SGID misconfigurations, that's also a yes. Overclocking the CPU to crash antivirus is not what we're trying to do, because that's, again, is going to raise a red flag. If the CPU or if the antivirus crashes, there's going to be red flags that are going to go off, and now they're going to be like, okay, why did antivirus crash? Let's go make sure that it doesn't crash again. And then in that process, they're going to probably strengthen the system even more, which is not favorable to you. Uploading JPEGs to bypass firewalls it's kind of like silly. I mean, you can technically have malware or some kind of command that's embedded in the macro of a JPEG, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. So it could work, but it's not the most obvious answer. So for me, the obvious answers would be A and B, and that's the answer. Great. What is the primary purpose of credential dumping in post-exploitation? To monitor system logs, no. To obtain password hashes and plain text credentials, yeah, that's the most obvious answer. To test kernel integrity, that's not the answer. That has nothing to do with this. So to deploy ransomware is also not the answer. We're trying to dump credentials, right? Usernames and passwords is what credentials are. Password hashes is what credentials are. So you're just trying to dump them. You're trying to download them. So password hashes or plain text credentials is what we're getting. Which of the following tools or techniques can be used for credential dumping? So what are the two tools? We have Mimikatz to extract passwords from LSASS. That's true. Reading Etsy Shadow on Linux for password hashes. If it's available, yes, that's actually true. So you can, inside of the Etsy Shadow file are password hashes. But more often than not, they're not accessible. It's been blocked off. Permissions are denied for this. So this can technically actually be true. So I'm curious. Wireshark for GUI logging has nothing to do with this. Metasploitable's DNS server also has nothing to do with this. So this is actually, yeah, reading Etsy Shadow and Mimikatz. Those would be my two answers. Excellent. Very good. By the way, so going back, this is something that was covered inside of the Linux Plus training series. So CompTIA Linux Plus playlist on this channel, we talk about this. So if you're not familiar with Etsy password is and what Etsy Shadow are and what these various partitions like Etsy themselves are, if you're not familiar with these things, then I would encourage you to actually study up on Linux. Studying up on Linux and network, so Network Plus and Linux Plus, studying up on those two topics will actually make you much better at understanding Pentest Plus concepts, and you will be using those concepts to figure out a lot of the answers. So we didn't technically talk about Etsy Shadow in the contents for this host-based video that we just did, but I just know that Etsy Shadow hosts these password hashes in it. It has those password hashes in it. What is the goal of the process hollowing during a host-based attack? So remember, we're taking the shell of a process and we're putting our stuff in it so that it is disguised, right? So to make a process easier to debug, no. To replace the code of a legitimate process with malicious code while retaining the original process name, yes. To improve CPU performance, no. To bypass network firewalls, yes, actually. So this is one of the things that would happen if you were doing the process hollowing. You're technically trying to avoid firewalls. However, it's not the primary answer, right? So the primary answer, the most obvious one, would be B, to replace the code of a legitimate process. Which of the following are valid examples of LOLBins, so living off the land, and that may be abused by attackers? So run DLL was one of them, WMIC was one of them. Go fish is actually not a binary. It's a tool. It's kind of a, I want to say it's a website actually. So GoFish is like a website that can help you create phishing campaigns. And Hashcat is a tool that we would use to crack password hashes. And we only need two answers here. So run DLL and WMIC are definitely the executables. And so here's another thing, right? When you think of a binary, think of an executable. And then when you think of an executable, you think .exe at the end of it, right? So when you're thinking about binaries, they execute, and then those things end in .exe. So that's what the answers are. Now, what is the primary function of evil WinRM during a Windows post-exploitation phase? So remote administration using Windows remote management with credential injection abilities, exploiting buffer overflows, port forwarding over SSH, or injecting SQL via PowerShell. So not necessarily. So this can be something that you can do with a remote connection, right? So evil WinRM is for getting remote connection, right? So you can technically do this when you have that connection. You can technically forward ports over SSH. You can technically exploit buffer overflows, but the most obvious answer is remote administration using Windows Remote Management, Windows RM, WinRM, that's what that stands for, with credential injection capabilities, and that is the answer. Which of the following tools can assist in host enumeration or credential gathering post-compromise? So Mimikatz, Seatbelt, Evil WinRM, Nikto, GoBuster. So Nikto and GoBuster are for more scanning web applications and websites for vulnerabilities and trying to enumerate their paths and subdomains, things like that. So those are not what I would be choosing. And by immediate elimination, those two are gone. So I'm only left with these three options. So Mimikatz is used for dumping password, sure, credential gathering, seatbelt, and evil win RM. So evil win RM is used for the connection, right, for the remote connection, but it's also for injecting credentials or stealing credentials. That's also one of the purposes that it has. And then seatbelt was the one that actually showed us, there's like, yeah, this group has system privileges, something like that. So A, B, and C would be the answers. Now, our first scenario, you've gained low privilege access on a Windows system. You discover a misconfigured service path that contains spaces and is unquoted. So it's a service and it contains spaces and is unquoted. You place a malicious executable in one of the path segments and restart the service. So which privilege escalation technique are you exploiting? Unquoted service path exploit, maybe. Process hollowing, maybe. ASREP roasting, and DLL side loading. So we're discovering a misfigured service path that contains spaces and is unquoted. You place a malicious executable in one of the path segments. That kind of sounds like process hollowing. That would be my guess. It could be one of the other ones too, though. Oh, unquoted service path exploit. Yeah, we didn't even talk about that. So an unquoted service path exploit. So it says it's unquoted. So this is the piece right here. That's a big clue right here. So it's unquoted and it's a service path. So it makes sense, but that's definitely not the answer to that. So I would have gotten this wrong. I would have gotten that incorrect. You run Mimikatz on a Windows machine and dump credentials from LSASS. You find plain text passwords and NTLM hashes. What type of activity is this? You are dumping credentials. It says it right there. We're dumping credentials. We're not scanning ports. We're not trying. We could technically be trying to avoid evasion, but we're also not doing SQL injection. The most likely answer is going to be A. There we go. You gain command execution through evil win RM on a compromised system. You run seatbelt exe to enumerate auto runs, browser data, and PowerShell history. What phase of post-exploitation are you performing? Host-based enumeration artifacts, lateral movement through Active Directory, wireless attack simulation, and VLAN hopping. I would say B for this one. Oh, it's A. My God, I got 2 wrong. Oh my gosh. Host-based enumeration and artifact analysis could be, yeah, that could be the answer. Yeah, for sure. You inject malicious code into the memory space of a legitimate process so that it continues to run under the original process name. This is process hollowing. So you're injecting code into the memory space of a legit process so that it continues to run under the original process name. That is process hollowing all the way. Ticket forgery, session replay, these things are actually legit attacks, but what we just got as a response right here was the exact definition of process hollowing. And that's it. We actually are now wrapped with section 4.4's practice question. And if you have any questions about what we just went through today, or if you want to have any comments or anything like that, please drop it in the comment section below. If not, make sure that you like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so that you get notified the next time that a video comes out on the CompTIA PenTest Plus training series that we're building. It comes out every Friday, a new episode comes out. And from there, just make sure that you are active in the comment section and you actually have the notification bell turned on so that you can get notified the next time that a video comes out. I hope you found value out of this video. If you have any questions, drop them below. It's your boy Hank Hackerson at Hank Hacks Hackers, your favorite network and system attacker / protector. If no one else loves you, Hank loves you. Love, peace, and chicken grease. A quick note from Hackaholics Anonymous, and we will be done for today. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. the agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there. Or you can go to youtube.com/@hankhackshackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous.